So, continuing with our discussion about religion and um, how religion as an identity is an indicator of identity, we were talking about the fundamentalist point of view of religion and how it thinks that religion has a say in everything what we do. So, so that's going to lessen the role. I mean, you want that to remain prominent, so oftentimes some of the from the fundamentalist point of view, you are going to oppose any kind of change to national identity that is going to lessen the role of religion. So I want that to remain prominent. You want to remain, if you talk about this is a Christian country, is built on Christian morals, that would be a classic example of very fundamentalist position. If you start talking like that. Finally, when we um, talk about another important aspect of identity is a more modern sense of or a place where people draw their identity from is the nationalism is itself, the nation, that is this political group, right, which gets beyond when you simply talk about ethnicity, which is similar, but nationalism is when it's organized politically, uh, and this we have already quite familiar with, where this kind of came about when people, rather than a monarch, we are now the bearers of nationhood, right? You would be a citizen. Now, sometimes the concept of the nation, the creation of nation precedes nationalism. Something like what happened in India or US, which were created before uh, there was any real sense of what is meant to be an American or what is meant to be an Indian. I mean, if I'm talking about Indian, I mean India, the country India. And it's many different regions that were so different. Uh, Nationalism developed afterwards. Other times, nationalism developed first, and people see themselves having their common ethnicity, having a claim to wanting to build a country together, to express that commonality before they can actually really form the country, uh, form that nation. You know, Italy or Germany might be example of that. What we are talking. Finally, pointing out again, oftentimes these nationalist movements, again, Nigeria is probably our best example of it from our cases, uh, can be a reaction against the monarchy or colonialism or occupation. That kind of activates a sense of, okay, what is our identity? Well, we are the native population that has been marginalized or colonized, and as a response to that, a certain national identity forms. Okay, so these are our basic kinds of indicators of identity. I think those are rather a straightforward. What I think is more theoretically is, well, how do I how do identities actually gets formed, and why is it that sometimes someone chooses to call themselves Italian American? Somebody feels that they want to be referred as African American, or using the term black. Where might that come from? Or why would you associate yourself with one national identity or not, or with mm, why would you associate yourself with another? This leads us to theories of what we call national identity formation. So, so basically, the theories of identity formation, not just the way it gets formed, but also whether it gets maintained. why you stay loyal to certain identity, why you might drop another type of identity. It's basically three kinds of theory behind this. The oldest one is what we call primordialism. Primordial is a word that means, from a long time ago. We often maybe hear that word primordial when we talk about the primordial soup of amino acid that from which the first cellular life came into being in the US. I mean, if you are one of those people who believe in evolution, right? So, primordialism here, what we are talking about um, is that the way you attach yourself to identity is a priori. Um, it's not something that comes afterwards, but it's innate in you. It's inside you. It's very effective, emotive in nature, meaning it's an emotional tie that you have. Your nature, if you kind of say, well, um, when you talk about blood ties, right? Every time I hear a bagpipe playing, draws me back to my youth from the highlands, right? That would be a very primordial sense. And indeed, primordialism as a theory um, of how identity forms was not something that was really created by political scientists, but much more by poets or people interested in creating arts, right? And there is something poetic or emotional about it, rather than studying this from a social scientific perspective. Yeah, I think that's about, but all I would say about primordialism, which oftentimes, like I would say, build on a sense of kinship, right? I draw my lineage. I am a daughter of American Revolution or the mythology, right? After this certain battle of our people arose to fight against the heathens, all that kind of stuff. They are very primordial way of talking about identity, and it kind of suggests that conflict might be innate because it's so emotional, right? Because it's so emotional, and it kind of traps you in that forever. You will, I mean, you will be born Irish, and then your children will have their Irish identity, and it gets passed on in the blood. Okay. Before we move on to instrumentalism, I should also want to say one of the problems of the primordialism is this idea that you can't change. That if it's innate and biological in you, it's not something that you can choose, right? Your identity chooses you. And that's, of course, means that you are kind of trapped there. And that, as a view of culture, something that doesn't really change, which is something that I have a big problem with thinking in those terms. But okay, as a second theory of instrument is called instrumentalism. And there it suggests that people choose a certain identity or choose a certain identities to gain an advantage in the politics of distribution. What I have written here is it's often ascribed, and when you're saying an identity is ascribed, it means it's not chosen for you, but you get labeled as something, right? And and for that, I think you don't need to look very far. Um, in US history, we have examples of, again, I would say, uh, quite identity, that differentiation between the white Europeans and the local population, right? The Aboriginal Native Americans who lived here, and the separation that was made, and those differences were largely meant to provide privileges and give advantages to the European settlers who were coming. Similarly, in another example of heavily ascribed characteristics is what the Nazis did to the Jews, right? kind of saying if you have these characteristics, you are a Jew and thus you can be dispossessed of property. Very similar to ideas in the US towards former slaves, right? And whether you identify it, somebody is free or not, and whether someone who was identified as being black or not, there was a formula for that. But what was the reason? Why? Right? Why? Why is that? It was a it was to disenfranchise people, or to say that they would not be able to vote, or that these are earlier days, we are still to be considered slave rather than free, right? And so we can see that this is often about something that emerges when you have scarce resources, right? And one group wants the property or a greater percentage of revenue from something. The idea, and that's why it is called instrumentalism, in that it results from a calculation, right? However, this calculation rarely comes from individual, but instead is based on the decision of the elites, leaders in different groups, who see advantages to ascertain certain um, in identities to another group, so that's the instrumentalism. Closer to this is, of course, the third theory of identity formation, which we call social constructivism. Social constructivism, um, uh, and here the idea is that there is no such thing as an identity that's just there innate. I mean, everything is a socially constructed view, right? I am a 5 foot 6 inches to children. That means I am tall, right? In American society, a male who is 5'6" is considered under average height. Okay, so again, whether 5'6" is tall or not, it's all rather relative. It depends on what context you are talking about. And because of this, also the identity is very socially constructed. Whether you feel Scottish or not, and kind of suggested, under primordialism, it was a sense that you feel, if if your mother was Scottish, then you hear the bagpipers and the tears starts coming down your eyes because it's in the blood. Well, no, what probably happens is that, when you are young, because you are so Scottish, your grandmother or grandpa sat you there on their knees and right, and when you start crying, Grandpa said, pick up the bagpipes and play him a piece, play the laddie of the song, a Highland tune to let him fall asleep. And that's why you get this emotional attachment. Because you have been taught, you have been socialized into it. You have been socialized into it. And again, it might suggest that if there are hatreds that exist, they might arise between different groups for instrumental reason, but they need to be taught. Again, they need to be propagated. You need to be creating differences. You need to have somebody teaching you these things. You learn in school what your own identity is, what it means to be Irish, what it means to be American, but also learn what it means to be other, right? To point out that somebody is wrong or bad, and it's all rather socially constructed. The social constructivism really focuses on the way the ethnicity is constructed. Lot of times, though, our education system, right, through religious traditions, help create these things as well. But the main point here, there, kind of in a trippy post modern way, is that reality is very contingent. It's not fixed, right? But it can be changed. You can teach something new, right? Again, I don't know, 40 years ago, anybody would have accepted the fact that nacho chips are American cuisine. They would say, no, it's not. That comes from south of a border.